Bonjour.
A very good morning. The 3,415th meeting of the Human Rights Committee is called to order.
The consideration of the report of Democratic Republic of Congo. Yesterday afternoon, the head of the delegation was responding to the questions by the members. And this morning, the head of the delegation will continue to respond to the questions by the members. And I give the floor to the delegation, and you can have 15 to 20 minutes to conclude your responses. So you have the floor, Madam, to respond, to continue to respond.
Bonjour à tout le monde.
A very good morning, everybody, and many thanks, Mr. Chairman. I will now continue trying to answer the range of questions that we were asked yesterday. If I remember correctly, I was just answering the question asked by Mr. Santos Pais. He asked a question on sexual and gender-based violence in armed conflicts and also in the school environment. Now, this is unfortunately well known that in the DRC there are many armed groups operating, and they operate throughout the country. Over the last 20 years, the reasons behind this are well known, and this is particularly the case in the east of the DRC. It was from 1994 that this really started, when there was the genocide in Rwanda. The international community asked the DRC to welcome many refugees from Rwanda. Among those people, there were some militants from the former regime of the president. They came into our country with their weapons. Some of them were accused of having carried out genocide in Rwanda. I won't go into too much detail on that, so as not to waste time, but we have certainly suffered the consequences of wars in other countries. I'm speaking about Rwanda, but I could have mentioned Burundi, Uganda, and even Sudan. I'm sure you're very well aware of what's going on in those states. As a consequence, we welcome refugees from those countries, and unfortunately there are some rebels, there are armed groups who enter our country, and we're trying to disarm those groups. So some of those people, unfortunately, raped Congolese women, and they used rape as a weapon of war to chase the local populations out from their villages. The rebels chose to sow terror, to kill men, to rape women, and to rape their daughters. The president of the DRC, a few years ago this was, he decided to appoint a special representative in the fight against sexual violence and the recruitment of children. Legal reforms were also undertaken at the same time, and the government of the DRC has made the fight against sexual violence a priority of the very highest order. As I said yesterday, the UN has acknowledged that the rate of sexual violence has gone down by 85% in the DRC. That's over the last 3 years. And that achievement is because we punished the perpetrators of that violence regardless of their roles. In Kinshasa today and in certain provinces, in particular in the east, there are many former military men who are in prison today because they were convicted of having been perpetrators of or complicit in sexual violence. This includes generals, colonels, high-ranking officials, regardless of the rank that they occupied. Even if they were very high-ranking officials, if they were found guilty of sexual violence, then they were ultimately punished. The struggle continues now, and we have a zero-tolerance policy. In schools, I won't be speaking about widespread sexual violence in schools, like we could mention that in the context of war and armed conflicts. But it has happened that a malicious teacher was able to abuse children's naivety to carry out such crimes. But I can't say it's something that's widespread in the DRC. All I can tell you is that the law clearly states that anybody who engages in sexual relations with a minor, whether the minor consents or not, that is considered to be rape. And so it is severely punished under the law. Yesterday, I answered the question on domestic violence, so to save time, I won't go back to that now. You wanted to know if the provincial technical committees in the fight against sexual violence are working. The answer to that is yes. The special representative of the head of state for the fight against sexual violence works in all provinces of the DRC to carry out monitoring and also to make sure that the local populations are aware of the phenomenon and the importance of fighting sexual violence. The DRC can be an example, I think, today for other African states who are going through the same problems themselves. Countries at war, in which rape is also being used as a weapon of war. I think those countries can learn from our experience in the DRC in their fight against this scourge. You asked if there are mobile justice units available in the various territories of the DRC, areas in which the district courts haven't yet been set up. The answer to that is we are trying to do this. But the situation isn't yet as optimal as we would like. We are endeavoring to remedy this situation, to try and reach the level required by international standards. I have to say, given the extremely large surface of the DRC and the budgetary constraints that we are suffering, it is sometimes difficult, but when we can, we do make sure that these mobile hearings are organized. Certainly there is room for improvement, and there are lessons to be learnt. I was also asked a question about legal aid, legal assistance, medical and psychological assistance, whether that is available, and whether victims are encouraged to come forward as witnesses. I would say yes, we certainly do encourage victims to provide a witness account. We can't fight against sexual violence without there being justice, and for justice to take place, people have to come forward as witnesses. There are some people who agree to do so, but unfortunately there are some people who are not willing to testify because they are afraid of reprisals. And some people are unfortunately also ashamed. They think that they might be stigmatized afterwards. They think that people might make fun of them because they suffered sexual violence. And the judge respects the choice of whether or not people want to hide their identity when they are providing an account or not. But the important thing is that they do so, and that helps to make sure that the perpetrators are appropriately punished by the competent authorities. For those victims who do not have the resources to pay for a lawyer, the DRC provides for lawyers. And in fact, in more than 90% of cases, it is the state that pays for the lawyer, because unfortunately many of the people who suffer sexual violence are not only demoralized, but they're also short of financial means. And so in that case, the DRC government provides lawyers to defend those victims. Medical assistance is also ensured, in particular in the eastern provinces, which were particularly affected by the scourge of sexual violence. These medical centers are funded by the state. They tend to be public health centers. And we also have international aid helping us. There are many NGOs who are helping us to support victims medically. And there are also doctors coming from abroad. But in fact, most of the doctors are DRC nationals. We also have psychological assistance that is provided. We don't have enough psychologists in the country, but the general medical staff try to fill in when we do have this shortage of psychological assistance so as to provide appropriate care for victims. But it takes a while for the victims to get over their experience. Some of them change their social environment, and then it becomes even more difficult because they have to be financially helped so that they can reintegrate once again into society, and so they can go and move to an area where they don't know anybody and where they have no reference point. You said that there are sometimes out-of-court settlements which go against the spirit of the law. Victims, be it in the DRC or indeed in other countries, the accused has the choice to ask for an out-of-court settlement when a person is suspected of having been a victim before the trial. If it is agreed that the matter can be solved within the family, then it is understandable that the judge is not able to do anything, because in order to convict somebody, the victim has to come forward and speak about what happened before the jury, that, for example, the rape did take place and X or Y person was the perpetrator. When the victim decides not to take the matter forward, then, of course, the judge is not able to do anything about it. You spoke about redress and compensation, collective compensation. I think we brought this up here last January. Now, it is true that that was asked of us. We asked the DRC government to look at collective compensation for victims. We agree with you, we think it's very important. Because, as I was just saying, when a woman has been raped, and it's not just once, on one day, when there are some women who were kidnapped and taken to the forest for a month even, and raped by 10 or 15 people. You can understand that they are in quite a state physically and morally. No compensation can really make up for the suffering and humiliation that they have suffered. But of course, if justice happens, then that is already some form of compensation. It is also important, though, for financial compensation to be paid. I think it's very important for us to get to this point and to achieve this goal. But we do have budgetary constraints. So at the moment, we're not able to overcome this challenge. The government is committed to do this. The government is mindful of the fact that it is very important. When it is possible, we will make sure we do it. But at the moment, the budgetary realities don't allow us to do so. Mr. Benachor mentioned enforced disappearances, summary executions committed by armed groups. You mentioned enforced disappearances. We have seen some cases, often in the conflict areas, these areas where armed groups operate without any regard for the law. They decide to undertake these enforced disappearances. Now, there are some people we've managed to track, but there are unfortunately some people who we haven't managed to find. First and foremost, because when the information reaches the competent authorities, by that time, it may be a couple of weeks after the disappearance has taken place, and the person may have gone to a far-flung village where the police isn't present, so we struggle to find the person, or where the communication media are not sufficient. Perhaps there's no phone link, there's no electricity, so it makes it much more difficult for us to track them compared to areas where we have television and electricity and so on. In these very remote areas, it sometimes can be very difficult to find people. I would just say that arbitrary executions are often ascribed to the armed groups. These armed groups may decide to kidnap civilians or police officers and kill them in front of everybody for their own reasons. Recently, Kamina Nsapu, the example that everybody saw. I think you may have seen the video. We saw this, the execution of Zaida Catalan and Michael Sharp, the 2 UN experts, which shocked everybody. And that's just one example. In the 21st century, there are human beings who cut other people's head off and who cut their throat. And they then take a photo with the head of the person that's been decapitated. Can you imagine that? It's really unacceptable, of course. So that gives you an idea of the heinous nature of these crimes. Now, these pictures are certainly not helping the image of the DRC, and so we're suffering more than everybody else, and that is why we're fully committed to ensure that the punishment fits the seriousness of these crimes and that these crimes are not present anymore in our country. You spoke about the demonstrations that took place in September and December 2016, where the police had to intervene. Now, it is true, yes, there were demonstrations in September and December 2016. Some parts of the opposition wanted to show their discontent about the fact that the government was not able to organize elections on time. Now, it's their right, and that is enshrined in the Constitution. But unfortunately, these demonstrations did degenerate. I think there were some malicious elements that infiltrated the demonstrations. And the headquarters of political parties were burnt down. Petrol was poured on the buildings and it was set alight. And this happened to the majority and the opposition. Weapons were used to kill the police. And in fact, there was demonstrators who filmed a police officer being burnt with a burning tire next to them. And this led to a lot of fear because there was looting, and that is why we decided no longer to authorize these demonstrations. When the political parties, the majority or the opposition decide to organize rallies or activities or demonstrations, they have to do so in closed areas, but in public areas, this is now prohibited as a result of security reasons. And I think this can happen elsewhere as well. After the Bataclan attacks, after what happened in Nice, France declared a state of emergency, and that's been going on for 2 years now. So that can happen in any country. For security reasons, we are not able to allow for public demonstrations, but it's only a temporary measure. When the security conditions are met, once again, we will lift this restriction and we'll allow the demonstrations. The chairman is telling me that I only have 5 seconds left, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister, for your detailed responses. We haven't finished the first round because members have follow-up questions to your responses, and we have to finish the dialogue by 1 o'clock. So I would like to appeal to everybody in the room, both the members and also the members of the distinguished delegation, to be succinct in their interventions. We do need to finish the dialogue by 1 o'clock today. So I would like to give the floor to the members to ask both follow-up questions and their questions in the second half, namely 16 to 28 plus 13, right? So members are invited to ask follow-up questions, and I'd like to give the floor first to Mr. Dufeville. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Madam Minister, for your replies. First of all, I'd like to start with a clarification, because I think you probably misunderstood my views yesterday when you reproached me for not mentioning the four support people concerning the Committee of Experts. I was talking about the role of MONUSCO of the UN and above all non-Congolese members of the team. MONUSCO is 20,000 people in the field. It being understood that throughout the dialogue we spoke about the DRC, the Congolese situation and Congolese victims of human rights violations. On other matters, I must say I expected a bit more of a reply to the questions that we asked, at any rate that I personally asked. I see the constraints of a small delegation. I had said that we were very pleased that you made the trip from Kinshasa, but perhaps here you are lacking expertise from the capital to give us more details. But what we would like to have from you, and perhaps you're also going to be providing them within the 48 hours following this dialogue, is facts and statistics and lists of measures that have been taken by the state party to implement the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In other words, what we are looking for is explanations concerning our questions and the allegations that we have transmitted to you. When we hear about allegations, these are purely allegations, but basically we have heard justifications referring to other parties' responsibilities, other countries' involvement, problems of budget and time, but not really explanations as to the measures that you are taking in concrete terms. So I would like, if possible, in your responses to hear more tangible details on the policies and measures that you are adopting. You have often spoken about the West and comparisons with the situation in the western part of the world. This is not a dialogue between the Western world and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is a dialogue in the framework of the committee dealing with implementation of the covenant, a UN instrument with 69 member states parties right now. And this idea of putting people into different camps bothers me. I don't think we should have the idea of different blocks with fixed ideas. Every country has controversies about homosexual marriage, for instance. As you mentioned, this was not fundamentally the issue that we raised. It was rather an issue of discrimination that we were describing, discrimination which occurs everywhere. But this subject is quite controversial in Europe as well, for example. So this brings me back to one of the questions. We cannot revisit everything, but given the time. But concerning the question of abortions, voluntary interruption of pregnancy, I was just asking a question. That is, what is the state party doing to protect women who are endangering their life and their health in view of the international obligations shouldered by the DRC under Article 6 and 7 of the Covenant? That's the question. There is something that we could have discussed already, and this is on the basis of a question, a very specific one I raised. There is an exception to the prohibition of abortion in the DRC, and that is therapeutic abortion. Therapeutic abortion exists. There is a protocol defined by the law, and you have indicated this in your response to the list of issues. My question had to do with accessibility for abortion. Now, there are allegations to the effect that even this exception, in fact, is not accessible. There are difficulties when trying to have a legal abortion in the DRC. And the question was not whether you're going to legalize abortion in all cases, but the question was, what are you doing to avoid having your compatriots, the persons that the state party is obliged to protect, pursuant to the obligations you've entered into, do not endanger their own lives. For example, let's take an example to facilitate the dialogue. Victims of rape. Does the state party thinking about what should be done in the case of a woman who's been raped? In all cases, to go back to the words you used, should she just put up with it and have the baby? This is a question that was raised in the context of sexual violence. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairperson, because there's a lot to discuss, but thank you in advance to the delegation for responses. Chairperson, thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Patatis. You have the floor. Pazartis.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. With your permission, I would like to make a few follow-up comments, and then I will go on to issues 13, 17 and 19, concerning which I'd like some clarifications. Is that all right? Thank you very much. So, good morning, and I would like to thank the delegation for yesterday's replies. Rather than... Well, I will make a few follow-up comments to save time. Echoing what has been said by my colleague, Mr. de Frueville, just now, this committee is aware of the unstable situation in the country and of the challenges that the state party is coping with in its quite significant efforts, moreover, to improve the human rights situation. It is not our purpose here to criticize, but to garner facts on whose basis we can have a constructive dialogue with the state party and possibly help it to overcome its difficulties. Now, yesterday, the members of the committee asked specific questions, particularly with respect to the actual implementation of legislative provisions which the state party has adopted, which are quite considerable, in fact. Now, as far as I am concerned, I did not hear many answers to specific questions that I asked, for example, concerning discriminatory practices, allegations of harassment or hate speech on the part of officials or religious leaders, even against LGBT people, for example. I didn't hear any specific reply either concerning the situation of albino individuals. For example, according to our information, there are 23 cases that have been recorded by albino defense associations that have not been followed up on, as far as we understand. So I'm just trying to say that we did ask rather targeted questions relating to factual situations on which we would like to have specific comments from the state party. I'm going to continue today, first of all, with issue number 13, the question here on the administration of justice. Some of the aspects of this problem or this question have already been touched on by my colleague, Mr. Santos Pais. This question relates to the measures taken to ensure the effectiveness and independence of the judiciary and information on the implementation of the recommendations that emanated from the Forum on Justice held in 2015. In particular, the number of judges recruited since the preceding report, the annual budget devoted to the justice sector, the number of courts throughout the territory of the country, and the question of the victim protection program. I would like to make some comments and then ask some specific questions. It seems that there has been no recruitment of judges since the exercise in 2010 to 2011 of 2,000 judges. Could the delegation give us some information which is a bit fresher? I know that new courts have been established. What has happened concerning the recruitment of judges since 2010-2011? Concerning the annual budget for the judiciary, you give us a figure. In the view of the delegation, is the budget earmarked for the justice sector sufficient? I say this because this also relates possibly to the issue of the recruitment of judges and also the number of courts that have been set up throughout the country. We have a table which you have put in your reply in paragraph 68. Now, these courts, are they distributed throughout the country? Or are there still regions where there are not enough courts in place? Could you provide a few more precise explanations on this? I think that the head of the delegation said that these courts have not been set up everywhere, perhaps. Now, concerning victim protection, I would like to ask him more specific question. It seems that for someone to benefit from the assistance provided by the judiciary and state-appointed lawyers, they have to provide a poverty certificate or low-income certificate. In order to get that certificate, it seems that one has to pay some costs which are borne by the victim. And could the delegation tell us if this is true, that the victims have to pay for these certificates, judicial services that are remunerated, which would mean that access to legal protection for the people who are the poorest members of the population might occur. I come back to another problem that has already been highlighted by several bodies. For example, the report of the High Commissioner's Office of the United Nations that covers the period from 2016 to 2017, which refers to the fact that many individuals have escaped from prisons. For example, according to the report in 2017, there were 4,300 detainees who got out of the Makala Central Prison in Kinshasa. And other information is provided on the escapes from the Goma prison or elsewhere that occurred. So my question is really, why is this happening? What is the reason for this large number of people escaping from penitentiary institutions? Is it due to a lack of staff? My second question is equally specific on this point. It has to do with investigations. Have investigations been carried out into these cases? And possibly have any results been achieved from those investigations? Any prosecutions instituted? I'm trying to be as specific as possible, Mr. Chairperson, so as not to take up too much time. This now brings me to questions 18 and 19. Now, these two questions relate to the protection of children. Certain problems have been mentioned yesterday and also today, this morning. In this connection, question number 18 relates to the recruitment of minors, of child soldiers, or of minors in general into armed groups. The state party gives us very little information. I note, for example, paragraph 98 of the replies, where we are aware that the state is making significant efforts towards zero tolerance, that target which was mentioned yesterday as well. It seems that there are still children in the ranks of the soldiers of certain armed groups. And here we hear about a recent law from 2009 that protects children and which brings together all of the provisions that had been scattered in other texts concerning the rights of the child. I would like to ask you if this law is fully operational. In other words, if all of the application measures concerning the law have been adopted. For example, the decree establishing the organization and functioning of the National Children's Council, has that been adopted? And are all of the courts and tribunals for children, have they all been established, particularly in the most troubled regions, so to speak? And again, concerning this legislation, the third sub-question, the acts of sexual violence against children, are those are punished, you say, but we haven't got information on the specific measures that have been introduced. For example, if prosecutions have been carried out, what has happened concerning criminalizing these acts in criminal legislation? This brings me to question number 19 in the list of issues, which asks the state party to describe the sorts of measures that have been introduced to combat the sexual and economic exploitation of children and to provide more detailed information on activities planned to combat the situation of children being subjected to the worst forms of child labor. The state party, in its report in paragraph 65, says that the labor code forbids all of the worst forms of child labor, including all forms of slavery, forced or compulsory labor, forced or compulsory recruitment of children, etc., etc., as well as any jobs which, by their nature or the circumstances in which they are carried out, are likely to harm the health, safety, dignity, or morals of children. And here also, I am going to focus on some specific questions. The estimates derived from the UNICEF report recently refer to 40,000 children working in the mining industry, above all in the Katanga region, in dangerous conditions detrimental to their health and for the environment in general. Very recently as well, the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2017, in its concluding observations, reaffirmed its concerns over the ongoing child labor in the mining sector. So my question is very down to earth. Could the delegation give us some clarifications on the tangible measures planned or already undertaken by the state party to guarantee the effective implementation of legislation governing child labor? For example, adopting measures aimed at carrying out investigations, prosecuting or punishing perpetrators of violations, as well as raising awareness among the population at large concerning this type of practice. Mr. Chairperson, I will stop with that, thanking the delegation in advance for any information it can share with us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Before I give the floor to the next speaker, I'd like to ask members to be as succinct as possible under the circumstances. I give the floor now to Mr. Koita. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, Madam Minister. Good morning, and good morning to the other members of the delegation. We are very happy to be continuing with this dialogue with you, which we hope will be a productive one. Before responding to question 16 on the freedom of individuals and paragraph 17 on the treatment of persons deprived of liberty, I would like to ask 2 or 3 small follow-up questions. The first has to do with the need for a more comprehensive national framework to deal with the protection and assistance that must be given to displaced persons. I take note of the fact that your country has acceded to the Convention on Refugees in Africa, but this does not remove the need for a national framework, which would be inspired by that. The second follow-up question: is it not necessary to carry out a swift, transparent, and independent inquiry to establish the facts, bring the culprits to justice, and provide for compensation for the violations which occurred in the Kasai region? Third follow-up question: please inform the committee about the status of the judicial procedures undertaken to shed light on the deaths of Zaida Catalan, of Michael Sharp, and thank you for having also clarified for that there were Congolese companions who accompanied them in carrying out their work. A specific inquiry into the violations of human rights and violence carried out in this region. Now, concerning the question on the liberty and security of persons, your report stipulates or states that to some extent the detention facilities which are not authorized have been removed. Now, Order 344, above all, in Article 8, provides for the possibility of temporarily detaining people in places that have not been determined in advance. And such facilities would thus escape any monitoring, and they're not on the central registry of prisons and short-stay prisons held by the Ministry of Justice, as indicated in your reply in paragraph 79. Also referring to your reply to the question in paragraph 80, you specify that judges are responsible for ensuring the regularity of detention and the detention facilities used for prisoners. And if these are determined to be irregular, the judges have the authority to refer the prisoners and to hold those responsible. We have seen that serious violations have occurred in prisons and intelligence units which would obviously escape the monitoring of competent authorities, in which the police officers do not carry out inspections. So my question is as follows. Could you describe the measures taken by the Democratic Republic of Congo to put an end to arbitrary and illegal detention perpetrated by state officials and above all by the LNR and the military? And could you ensure that the officials who are responsible for such acts are punished and that the victims can benefit from full compensation? Has the government planned to close these detention facilities that are closed to the monitoring of judges? Concerning custody, despite the monitoring measures which have been established, it seems that the national police lockups are very overpopulated and small, and often the prisoners are on the verge of suffocation. I would like to know what measures have been taken or what measures your government plans to take to remedy this situation and to ensure compliance with certain rules on detention in accordance with the provisions of the covenant, above all, the right to be informed of the reasons for one's arrest, compliance with the deadlines on pretrial detention as laid down by the law, the right to consult with counsel, with a lawyer, and the right to inform one's family, and the right to be examined by a doctor. Concerning the treatment of persons deprived of liberty, it is a question here of specifying, I would say, your report in paragraphs 111 and 112 talks about the joint composition of committees for dealing with prisons. Could we hear about the procedures used for appointing members from civil society, as well as could we know if the votes of members are all equal in this committee? Several observers have mentioned the organizational flaws in the monitoring facilities of places of deprivation of liberty in terms of responsibility and authority in particular, allowing the penitentiary administration full leeway to and to have very unprofessional or quite unprofessional, insufficient staff. One of the consequences is the high number of deaths in places of detention, the main causes of which are overcrowding in the prisons, malnutrition, the lack or shortage of health care, and the insufficient level of budgets for prisons. So I'd like to know if the government is prepared to act in parallel to tackle these different causes, to improve the conditions of detention and to reduce significantly the number of deaths in detention, which between January and December 2012 was 211. This figure seems to be on the rise in subsequent years. My question is as follows. The professionalization of judicial and penitentiary prison staff, is this not one of the priorities that your government should seek to pursue in its activities to humanize prison conditions? Now, concerning pre-trial detention, the Congolese Constitution in Article 17 stipulates that individual freedom is guaranteed. And the rule is that detention is the exception. Now, if pre-trial detention is covered in the criminal procedural code, from actual practice, it seems that the conditions and the procedures used do not comply with the legal texts. It seems that initially the use of pre-trial detention is very frequent and abundant, which means that this is not an exceptional measure. By way of example, the Makala Central Prison had some 6,700 pre-trial detention cases in on December 31st, 2016. Moreover, the DRC has ratified the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment in 2010, but it has not yet established a national mechanism for prevention as provided for by the protocol. My question is if the government plans in the predictable, foreseeable future to introduce such a mechanism. And my last question, Madam Minister, on this subject. Alternative policies to imprisonment, are they being implemented? What is the timetable for the rehabilitation of former detention facilities, and what efforts are you making to build new prisons in the DRC so as to comply with UN norms in this respect? On another subject relating to the communication provided to the committee by Jean-Jacques Lumumba, while taking note that Mr. Lumbala benefited from measures of easing political tension as provided for in the political agreement of the 31st of December 2016, which you mentioned in paragraph 82 of your replies to the question. The committee regrets the fact that the State Party has not provided any clarification on the admissibility or the substance, the merits of the complaints of the author. It regrets the fact that paragraph 2 of Article 4 of the optional protocol obligates the states parties to give in good faith consideration to all allegations brought against it and to communicate to the committee all information available to it. The optional protocol entered into force on for the DRC on February 1st, 1977. So my question is whether you accept the allegations going back to November 2015, going along with the obligation to give full compensation to a person whose rights recognized by the covenant have been violated. And in this particular case, is the DRC prepared in particular to carry out a complete and effective inquiry on the facts that occurred, punishing the perpetrators and giving the author full compensation and appropriate measures of satisfaction? It is also obliged to ensure that similar circumstances do not repeat themselves. Thank you very much, Madam Minister, for the replies you'll be providing for continuing this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Next speaker is Mr. Benashor. You spoke quite long in the first round, so you have less time in the second round. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I would like to thank the delegation for the answers it gave yesterday. I just have a few brief follow-up questions. I would like to echo some of my colleagues who said that they didn't receive answers to some of the questions that they'd raised. By way of a follow-up question, I would like to ask a core question. Given that one of the reasons for the social and political crisis that the DRC has been experiencing today is as a result of this matter of the elections and the mandate of the current president of the Republic. Madam Head of Delegation, you spoke about the electoral process and the registration of voters. Could you give us a precise idea of this electoral process, the deadlines, the timelines foreseen, and in the short or medium term, what do you think are the chances of these elections being organized as soon as possible? The second comment I'd like to make concerns the fact that we spoke about the use of violence in false disappearances and atrocities committed in some parts of the DRC, committed by government forces, that is to say, the army and the police. You keep saying that the militias are responsible for the violence, that the militias carry out the atrocities. And there are certainly terrorist acts which you mentioned, like the terrible atrocity of seeing police officers decapitated, and so on and so forth. Now, we do completely agree with you. We don't deny that that happened. We have said this several times, that indeed the militias, be they in favor of the government or not, are responsible for these atrocities. But that's not the crux of the matter. We asked for explanations about the convictions, prosecutions, and inquiries into the atrocities when they are committed by security forces or military officials. You've said they're terrorist acts, and we agree with that. I would just say that you are representing a state, an army represents a state, the police represents a state, and the state does not have the right to use the same procedures as terrorists, even though the victims of, even with the victims of atrocities, the state has obligations, and it has a moral obligation under international law not to use the same means. You've also said that NGOs who provide us with information, you say that they are more in favor of the opposition, and you almost consider them as being part of the opposition. Well, let's suppose that's true. Let's just imagine it's true. Do you think that the OHCHR is part of the opposition as well? The information that I personally used in the case of enforced disappearances in Kasai or elsewhere, this is information that we have, and we have received from official authorities who are publicly, officially set up in the DRC with the agreement of the government of the DRC. So I don't think it's credible to say that this information is all biased, or that the representative of the UN in the DRC supports the opposition and is therefore biased. So that is what I have to say by way of follow-up questions. I now come on to issue 20, very briefly. This is with respect to the fate of street children and the fight against child trafficking networks in Kinshasa. You've given us some information on this, interesting information in paragraph 94 and other paragraphs in the responses of the State Party. You say that to curb this phenomenon of street children, that you have drafted standards for care for vulnerable children, and you've implemented the project for street children financed by the World Bank, and there are also studies for the implementation of the program to support vulnerable households. And you also mentioned the national protocol for reference for vulnerable children and the national protocol for social assistance, a handbook for social protection, and so on and so forth. The question that I would like to ask is the following. You use very broad technical concepts, but you haven't given information, detailed information about these programs. You've just given their names and the general concepts, but we don't really get any concrete meaning there. So I would like to know what is the practical impact of these programs on the fate of street children. On the matter of child trafficking, to fight against child trafficking networks, you say that the government is undertaking measures to monitor all structures for child care, and you say that measures have been taken to suspend international adoption. In this regard, we would like to ask the following question. Are these measures enough to curb the phenomenon of child trafficking? Next, on the fate of so-called witch children. To solve this problem, you say in paragraph 96 that you have set up various projects, and these are similar projects as for those rolled out for street children to provide financial support for vulnerable families. You also say that you close down these schools who carry out harmful practices. Churches that carry out harmful practices. Now, you've spoken about accusations of witchcraft, but in fact they have only increased for more than 20 years in the DRC. And I think many researchers have looked at this issue, and I briefly had a look through such works, and apparently it's as a result of the state's failings by a proliferation, apparently, of NGOs in Kinshasa, and apparently that has led to a considerable development of religious movements, including Christian fundamentalist movements, including apocalyptic movements, who exploit this state of affairs. Why do they do so? Because the majority of the Congolese population is in a state of survival. The rich are getting richer, but the working class and the middle class are getting poorer, and they are therefore despairing for their situation. And so that is why they may turn to these means of refuge, and they turn to these fundamentalist churches, which ultimately exploit the situation, and sometimes for financial reasons, because they are paid for their services. The problem is that these practices sometimes lead to extremely high levels of violence. And we have NGOs and researchers who have looked into this matter and who have found that these practices carried out in these churches are sometimes extremely violent in nature and can sometimes even be classified as torture. So these new situations for children, some children in the DRC who may be caught up in the economic crisis and the warfare and so on, to try and help themselves, they are directed towards these churches, but unfortunately sometimes this leads to extreme violence, as I said, and this can even lead to torture being practiced on these children. So I would ask the following question. Is the government aware of the enormous scope of this problem? And the measures indicated in the answers, are they sufficient to help children who are ultimately victims of this phenomenon? I now finish with issue number 21. This is about the registration of children. It seems that only 27.8% of children under the age of 5, only 27.8% of children under 5 were registered at birth. You've explained the situation a bit. You say that people aren't aware of the need to do it, and so on. And you speak about some of the measures that the state has taken to try and remedy this state of affairs, or rather the very low rate of birth registrations. For example, you have undertaken a campaign for all children in school. That's with the support of the World Bank. You have also strengthened the capacity of provincial focal points and created secondary offices in the country, and you've mentioned that. The question I would like to ask is, can the delegation provide us with more specific information about the tangible effects of the aforementioned measures to try and increase the rate of birth registration? Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Branskeris. Thank you very much, Chairman. I just have a brief follow-up comment, and then I will be looking at issues 22, 23, 24, and 28. I would like to thank the Minister for the answers that we received yesterday to issue number 6, but I would also like to say that we did hope for more specific answers. In particular, the issue of domestic violence is not included in the national strategy for the fight against gender-based violence. But you do say it's a concern, and you do acknowledge that there is a need to change behaviours and attitudes, and that violence against women is widespread, socially accepted, and as being only part of the private domain. Is the government planning on taking any specific measures to fight against domestic violence, for example, by amending the legislative framework or rolling out strategies? The awareness-raising campaigns on the family code, you mentioned those yesterday. Does that specifically include information on this type of violence? Are these campaigns going to continue, and what specific measures are intended to carry out or to engender this change? I now move to issue number 22. Thank you very much for the information about the suspension of television programs in 2016, and it seemed that the foreign channels had to be brought in line with the law going back to 1986. It seemed that if there were certain regulations that had to be adhered to, and the television channels that you refer to broadcast throughout the country now. We have some information about the RFI channel, the fact that this was only able to broadcast once again from the 11th of August this year, however. We have information also about the decree of the 12th of November 2016. This doesn't call into question the capacity of the foreign media to broadcast in the DRC, but that foreign media in the DRC have to sign partnership contracts with a radio station in the country, while those who are not established in the DRC are only able to carry out their work if they engage in a partnership. But in other contexts, there is a perception of being on the side of the opposition as a pretext for restrictions, including by the Ministry of Information. And this leads to questions about any restrictions based on the content of these programs. So what measures does the government intend to take to uphold the freedom of expression and the freedom of the media, both foreign and national media, including by respecting political pluralism without any censorship pursuant to the Constitution and Article 19 of the Covenant? We also noted in the answers to the list of issues that the Supreme Audiovisual and Communication Council is the guarantor of the freedom of the press and all mass media communications in respect of the law, and you say it has played a regulatory role as foreseen by Law 011. Could you tell us about the appointment and the composition of that council as compared with the government, and could you also say what measures have been taken by that council in its work since November 2016 as a regulator to support the freedom of the press and mass media in the DRC? Is it true that foreign media have to go through the Ministry of Communication, while there is a responsibility to confirm the media's administrative status, and that could maybe lead to some contradictions. With regard to the suspension of social media for 2 weeks in 2016, you explained in the answers to the list of issues that this was done to uphold public order. But without any clarifications, why would that decision be necessary and proportionate to that end? More recently, reports have indicated that on the 7th of August 2017, the president of the Regulation Authority for Telecommunications asked social medias to block the transmission of pictures. Could you comment on that? We also noted in your answers with regard to Ordinance Law 300 from 1963, we note that you say that you do not intend to modify the provisions on the penalizing offences against the head of state and to put an end to the criminalization of defamation and press offences. But perhaps it doesn't exclude the possibility that there may be developments in the future. So I'm wondering if you are looking at laws on this matter, which would make it possible to carry out the necessary amendments, better to align national law with the Constitution and the provisions of the Covenant. Issue number 23. Thank you very much for the clarification on Decree Law 196 of the 29th of July 1999, with prior authorization for campaign rallies. That's no longer applied because the Constitution only stipulates prior notifications being necessary. But could you give us information about the progress towards the adoption and the implementation of a new law establishing modalities to ensure the freedom to demonstrate, as well as the harmonization of national legislation with the Constitution? The ban on some demonstrations that took place are done to uphold the public order in order to prevent any abuse after the experience that you had, and you mentioned this earlier. However, numerous reports indicate, as the High Commissioner for Human Rights also did in his report on the DRC at the 36th session of the Human Rights Council, he was concerned about the considerable reduction in the democratic space. He noted that bans are almost always as a result of demonstrations carried out by the political opposition, while those supporting the government and the president are generally not prohibited, which does not support the argument that public order is the reason for these prohibitions, which in any case also have to be not only pursuant to the law, but also the principles of necessity and proportionality, so as to be pursuant to Article 21 of the Covenant. On the 10th of April 2017, protesters were against the agreement, some protesters were arrested, and we also have information from credible sources that marches that were going to be held in September this year by 11 organizations to honor the events of the 19th of September last were banned. The organizers were harassed and they were arrested ultimately when they went to go to the marches, and they were freed only 5 days later. Could you comment on these allegations of the restrictions that I have mentioned? What measures do you plan to take to safeguard the freedom of assembly for all political rallies, including those that criticize the current government and those of civil society in general during the pre-electoral period? Now, issue 24. We've taken note of the answer that the allegations of excessive use of force by the police and security forces and the distribution of machetes during the events of the 19th to 21st of September 2016 and arrests were unfounded. That's what you said, and you spoke about them this morning as well. However, credible information and detailed information from many human rights organizations have provided this information, and this was supported a few weeks ago by the High Commissioner of Human Rights in his report on the DRC. He mentioned his concern about the use of excessive force by security forces, which would indicate that indicating that the UN Bureau in the DRC has, in fact, documented 1,080 violations of human rights by the Congolese police during the period between June 2016 and May 2017. This is roughly the double of the previous period, and it draws attention to the use of disproportionate force to disperse rallies. Do you have any comments on that or any information about the actions of the police? What are the legal and institutional safeguards that exist against the abuse of force by the police? What are the methods that are used by the police? For example, is there monitoring in place for demonstrations or other peaceful gatherings that would allow the government and the Human Rights Commission to have trustworthy information about from independent sources about the use of force by the police in different areas? Finally, I come to issue 28. Well, we thank you for the information with regard to the situation of indigenous peoples, including pygmy groups. We noted that the displacement carried out in the Tanganyika province was subject to heightened attention from the government, and you mention a commission to deal with the land conflict problem, which is said to lead to violence, which in turn leads to displacements. However, we have received information indicating that in spite of the mission of the Ministry of the Interior, including in 2017, peaceful co-settlement between the Pygmies and other communities has not yet been carried out, and that the displaced Pygmies live in very precarious conditions and extreme vulnerability, and that the access to their traditional land is under threat. Could you tell us about how the government has looked at that situation and if additional measures are in the pipeline to support peaceful co-settlement? With regard to the situation of the Pygmies, we noted your answer. You said that they have the same rights as any other community and the same advantages in the health and education sectors. However, to say whether or not discrimination actually exists, it's not enough to simply speak about the rights enshrined under law, and Ms. Patsatis also asked for clarifications about the comprehensive law, which I echo. But we also need to have statistics which bear witness to the real situation on the ground so as to shed light on whether they have practical access to these rights. What about data and statistics for Pygmies, including in the areas of health and education that you mentioned yourself? How do you carry out the collection of data, and have you really looked closely at whether they are victims of discrimination? The State Party also said that Pygmy groups can be found in all areas of national life, health, administration, the army, the police, and so on. Could you provide us more specific information about this statement, including the degree to which the Pygmy communities are represented in these various sectors? And finally, to wrap up this issue, could you indicate the content of the draft law in the Parliament that you mentioned in your answers to the list of issues, which aims to allow ethnic groups to keep their own cultural life? And could you tell us how close that law is to being adopted and how long you think it will take to be adopted and promulgated? Thank you very much in advance for your answers.
The next speaker is Mr. Santos Pais. You have less time today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairman, Madam Minister, members of the delegation. A very good morning. I do understand that you have a very difficult task ahead of you in responding to all of these questions, but it is our job to ask so many questions. Today I will deal with issues 25, 26 and 27. I will speak much more briefly than I had planned because you have already answered some of the questions that I had planned to ask. So I will simply pinpoint some specific issues that would hopefully help the committee to have a clearer idea of the situation in the DRC. And I would also echo what my colleagues have previously said what we really want to know, what we really want to do is try and understand what's going on the ground. We have information from the state and also from civil society. And also, in this dialogue, what we're trying to do is try and have a deeper understanding of what is really going on in the country. Let me deal with the issue of the protection of journalists, human rights defenders, and political opponents. We have received allegations from credible sources who speak of judicial harassment, threats, and sometimes killings and violations against media professionals, with violent attacks, arbitrary detentions carried out by the police, so by the security forces, and also cases involving human rights defenders and political opponents, in particular in the case of the demonstrations of 2016 that have already been mentioned. In this regard, the High Commissioner of the UN highlighted the case of about 130 human rights defenders, 34 journalists, and 97 other victims. So these are figures that are quite striking. However, the state has said that these allegations are unfounded. The question I would like to ask why has no inquiry been carried out against the state agents and security officials, including military officials, on the basis of what has happened over the last 3 years? For us, having statistics that allows us to understand what the state is saying on the credibility of these allegations. The state party also says that people were prosecuted as a result of ordinary civil crimes, and there have been cases that have been mentioned. But I would like to know if the state party could provide us with statistics on the number of convictions handed down against journalists, human rights defenders, and political opponents over the last 3 years. Could you speak about the reasons for the convictions and the sentences handed down so that we can understand the scope of the problem?
It
would also be useful to find out, for example, concerning the people who participated in the activities of 2016, who were imprisoned and who participated in plundering and insurrection activities. It seems that no state officials have been investigated or prosecuted for actions undertaken in the framework of actions taken by the authorities to control and repress these demonstrations. This is strange because there were deaths, there were injuries, there were people that were arrested, and I think it was quite a major issue throughout the country. Now, this brings us to issue 26 concerning the Unit for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, established by Ministerial Decree 219, June 2nd, 2011. This is above all an early warning unit composed of national and provincial committees. I think this is a fascinating idea. So I would like to ask you to give us some clarifications as to the main activities carried out by this unit as a sort of watchdog body. What successes does it have on its record, and what are the consequences of the actions of this unit to remedy and deal successfully with the cases brought before it? Now, concerning the bill for the protection of human rights defenders that was approved in the Senate and that is currently being discussed in the National Assembly, it seems, according to information we have received, that the bill in the form where it was discussed in the National Assembly is rather harmful for the protection of human rights defenders. Do you have any comments on this idea? This might relieve and reassure the civil society organizations on this. Now, lastly, I think you were right when you talked about electoral agencies, which Mr. Benachou also referred to. The problem derives from the fact that the President Kabila, who is finishing his second consecutive term as President of the Republic in accordance with the Constitution, cannot try for another term. It is this type of question, that is whether he is going to stand or not for a third term, that has aroused all of these concerns and caused so much tumult in civil society concerning the electoral issues. A timetable was established for several elections up to the end of 2016, which did not take place. There was an agreement of December 31st, 2016, concerning the preparations for fresh elections. So what I would like to ask you is, in the final analysis, what is the current state of play concerning these election schedules? Is there any timetable for the elections? Are there further difficulties you need to overcome? If so, what are they? So that we can have a clearer idea of the scope of the issue. Because in actual fact, in terms of participation, elections are the natural way of having the people of the DRC express their views freely and democratically. Concerning the candidates who have been declared for the presidential election, there are several candidates who, to some extent, have encountered problems with the law and order forces. The secretary of the agency, and who was detained and then only released, Mr. Benjamin de Gongola, who disappeared at the end of July 2012, and about 4 months later he reappeared only in October 2016. Mr. Jacques Chavagny of the Party of Union for Democracy and Social Progress, who was arrested on February 8th, 2012. Well, these three individuals all claim that they were tortured by the infamous National Intelligence Agency. In addition, on February 24th, 2016 in Kinshasa, members of the armed forces arrested National Deputy Martin Fayou, president of the opposition party Commitment for Citizenship and Development. At the headquarters of his party, he was treated roughly when he was protesting against his arbitrary detention. So if there are violations of common law against these people, could we know what those offenses are? Because the problem from the viewpoint of the international community and civil society is to know if the judicial institutions in the country are not using these types of procedures to avoid having these candidates run and present their opinions before the general populace. Lastly, there is the case of the president of SCODA, Congolese Solidarity for Democracy, who, it seems in his case, was convicted on April 12, 2017, to 5 years in prison and a fine of $10,000 of compensation for actions carried out 13 years ago. Now, this member, these are a number of incidents, rather, concerning candidates to presidential elections to take place in the future do suggest many questions, and we would be very appreciative if you could explain what this is all about. I will not ask questions about the fires of headquarters of political parties. You already responded to that. Nonetheless, there were 7 or 8 political party headquarters, not only of the opposition, but also belonging to the presidential majority, who it seems were the target of this type of activity. So the question is, in the final analysis, who was prosecuted for these actions and were they convicted? And if so, what were their punishments? Thank you in advance for your patience. Thank you.
The floor to Mr. Shani. Please be brief.
Thank you, sir. Puisque c'est la première fois que
Since this is the first time I've taken the floor in this dialogue, I wish a warm welcome to the delegation of the DRC, and I thank you for your replies. I will ask my questions in English with your permission.
I wish to expand very briefly on the general point made by Mr. de Frouville, with which I agree. And I think you made yesterday, Madam Head of Delegation, a very strong point about the importance of diversity. We cannot disagree that diversity is an important value, but there is another important value, and that is the universality of human rights. And the covenant to which DRC is a party is based on universally accepted human rights. So we, the committee, which are both diverse and also a universal body, are the guardian of these obligations, and our job is to remind state parties of their international obligations and to indicate laws and policies which we think would best facilitate the implementation of these obligations. I wanted to expand specifically on an issue mentioned by Madame Patsarsis, my colleague, and this is the equal treatment of LGBT persons. I understand the DRC may not be ready, as the Minister explained, to introduce same-sex marriage, although I would argue that the Constitution can be perhaps interpreted in other ways, because it indicates a right to marry. It does not prohibit marriage outside the scope of the right, but this is indeed something on which we do recognize the importance of local sensitivities and the need perhaps to move gradually in this. But when it comes to actual cases of mistreatment of LGBT persons, there are specific provisions of the treaty, of the covenant, Article 2, Article 17, Article 26, that come into play. And our concern in this regard is that although DRC does not criminalize homosexuality, we have received allegations that LGBT persons are sometimes arrested and charged under Article 176 of the Criminal Code, which prohibits activity against public decency. And there are also reports of LGBT persons who are being arrested with regard to their alleged mistreatment. We have specific reports, which I don't have time, but they are public record. And the state is invited to address them. So my question is whether, what is the government's position on these arrests under Article 176? What is the government's position on private bills that seek to criminalize explicitly homosexuality? And what measures is the state party taking to protect the physical integrity of LGBT persons and to prevent their discrimination? Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Mr. Muhumuza. Please be brief.
Thank you very much, and I will indeed be brief. This being the first time, I would like to welcome the Honourable Minister and her delegation and to congratulate her upon yesterday's election by the General Assembly of the DRC to the Human Rights Council. I hope this will enhance your activities in this area. Madam Head of Delegation, you mentioned that many people came from neighboring countries, including Uganda, and that we all know what is happening in those countries. I must say, however, that your presentation left a lot to be desired. It is as if the people living in DRC were all saints until the foreigners came upon them. Well, not too long ago, we had the opportunity to hear it from Rwanda delegation who were appearing before this committee. They answered for their part, and the least we would expect is for your delegation to respond to specific queries are not to pass the buck to your neighbors. So I hope that in the next opportunity, which you have just got in the next round of questions, you'll be able to answer specifically, and if not, maybe call upon your experts back in the capital to provide these same answers as required. Generalities will not suffice because there are specific people and situations which have been asked about. And yeah, I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Politique. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. This is the first time that I have had the privilege of taking the floor in this dialogue with the delegation of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I would like to welcome above all the delegation and the head of delegation, Madam Minister. Yesterday, we received some information and several replies concerning the fight against impunity for the most serious crimes. And the head of delegation, Madam Minister, mentioned the International Criminal Court, in particular, which played a very important role in the situation in the DRC from its very inception as an international judicial body. There were cases that have become very important in the context of international criminal law, Lumbala, other cases. And I think there has been effective cooperation from DRC on that front. The minister significantly stressed the fact that international justice moves forward very, very slowly, and that one cannot ask the Congolese justice system to be more expeditious than the International Criminal Court is. It's not a competition between the two. Their roles are totally different. I think we have to remember the principle of complementarity. The role of the International Criminal Court is one, and the domestic justice system is quite another. So my question, I think, is as follows. The minister has not taken sufficient account of the progress made in the International Criminal Court that has significantly shortened the times of preliminary trials and first instance consideration, and the fact that in the principle of disclosure of evidence, that stage has been significantly shortened. That is not the issue, however. My question is a more subtle one, if you like. Does this mean, or is it a sign that there's a change in feeling vis-à-vis the role of the International Criminal Court with respect to the DRC situation? I think it's very important to know if the level of trust and confidence in the role of the ICC is the same as it was at the beginning of the work of the ICC, which was requested by the Democratic Republic of Congo to intervene. One should not forget that there was a referral of the Congolese situation by the DRC to the ICC. So I am asking this because a lot has been said about violence in the Kasai province. We know full well that there have been statements before the Security Council by the prosecutor, and the court is prepared to intervene, of course. And it recalled the principle of complementarity the need for a real inquiry to be carried out to shed light on the facts and on violence, and the need to bring the perpetrators to justice. It would be interesting to know if there has been a change in terms of the confidence felt by the DRC in the role of the ICC, or if something has changed in this respect. Does it have any particular criticism to level concerning the role of the International Criminal Court in the Congolese situation? Thank you.
I take it that members have finished their questions, both follow-up questions and questions regarding the second half of the list of issues. Thank you very much. I just consulted with the head of the delegation. We continue without pause because that way the delegation will have more time to respond. Under the circumstances, we continue, okay? So I give the floor to the head of the delegation, Madame.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I would like to thank the entire committee, and in particular the members who have asked questions of me. I will do my best to answer all of the questions. The questions that I will not be able to provide precise answers on, I will come back to. I will consult with experts and provide you with replies within 48 hours. I would like to point out that certain experts were not able to come because they could not get a visa from the Swiss embassy. One of the members of the committee told me yesterday that he's having difficulties getting a visa to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that's been the case since August. Well, when it comes from our country, you talk about violations of human rights, that we're trying to hide things. Does Switzerland have anything to hide? I can't but ask this question, Mr. de Frueville, in a friendly spirit. We're here speaking frankly. Experts were not able to get their visa, but I do have a mission order signed by the Prime Minister and the ordinance signed by the head of state. It gives me the right to be accompanied by people. I came with only one expert from Kinshasa, who's in the middle here. This lady is the Chargé d'affaires here, and the last gentleman is a resident here in Switzerland. So you understand that I cannot help but ask this question. Let's get down to the crux of the matter, however. Mr. de Frueville said something very important. In this room, we're not here to debate in terms of Africa versus the rest of the world. All of the world is represented here. Mr. Koita, who is an African, just like me, if he had asked me the same questions that you asked, I would have responded in the same terms. I didn't simply say certain things to you because you are from the West and we other are Africans. We others are Africans. I was speaking generally. I am thinking out loud. These are questions that we debate in the African Union as a whole. When the West accepts certain things, when I say the West, I'm basically thinking of countries which consider themselves to be much more powerful and more influential. When the West believes that certain things are acceptable, those are imposed on the entire world. I was saying that 20 years ago, no one accepted homosexual marriage in the West, and no one spoke about human rights violations that was acceptable. Now that certain Western countries have accepted same-sex marriage, people come back and say when countries whose societies do not accept this phenomenon, do so, they are violating human rights. I can't help but say, and do remember that when I say these things, I am thinking out loud. One cannot impose on the entire world the thinking of a certain group of country alone. I think this and this, I'm sure, will be supported by many other Africans. We cannot accept certain things being imposed on us when we don't want them. And today we're being told that we are violating human rights simply because we refuse to go along with these stances adopted in certain countries who didn't accept these things 20 years ago. What's changed in the meantime? The Bible hasn't been revised, the Quran hasn't been amended, nor has the Torah. What's changed? It's the people who have changed. Give us time to evolve. It's not a war, but since the entire world is represented here, and since we are having an open dialogue, and since here in the committee we can allow ourselves to say things like they are and to have a debate, I think you should also tolerate it if we say things in rather rough terms. If it shocks you, I'm sorry, but I feel that I have to say certain things. Now, I will come back to certain points. For example, when you talk about the West, human rights, at any rate, from what I've read, it is recognized that everyone in the world is fighting terrorism in the West and in Africa. The same phenomena are occurring in the West, and they're called terrorism. And when it happens in Africa, we're told that these are rebellions and militia, and no one gets worked up. I can't prevent myself from saying this. I'm not saying this only to you, but to the entire world. Now, it's true that there are certain who die in action. These people have chosen to kill innocent people. Let me just ask a question, but you don't have to answer it. I think that bin Laden terrorized the entire world, and that certain leaders decided he had to die. And we think the same in Democratic Republic of the Congo, that no one misses him. But the question I would ask is, which article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights gives a country the right to throw his body into the sea because he's dead? He should be returned to his family so that the body can be buried. Maybe his wife and children might have liked to bury him, even if he was a bad guy. This is a question I am asking, but it's rather rhetorical. So the same reproaches can be made of others. Now, I've come back to your question. You talked about abortion. What is the Congolese state doing to protect women who want to have an abortion? Well, your question is very timely, and I understand where it's coming from, but given the current state of affairs, the state is doing nothing because the law prohibits abortions. At the same time, perhaps the state should have taken steps to avoid unwanted pregnancies by incorporating sex education in the school curricula as of, say, 15 years of age, for example. That there be information provided about birth control pills and condoms, also to combat AIDS, to avoid unwanted pregnancies, above all for young girls. We're going to be thinking about this possibility, but right now it's true sincerely that the state is doing nothing. I understand it's important to do something to avoid having illegal abortions occur, which often kill people. We're going to think about it, but I won't promise that our society is ready to accept abortion. And again, it is not I who embody the entire country. There are 70 million Congolese who are independent thinkers, and I'm not in control of everything. You say that a lot of people have difficulty having access to legal abortion. What do you do in cases of rape, you asked? For cases of rape, when it has been proven that a woman has been raped and that she cannot keep the baby, the judge will authorize an abortion. And a doctor will be authorized to carry out the decision handed down by the judge. But the rub is that, I don't know who it was who mentioned it here, but there is a concern. Well, some women don't talk about it, and those who do talk about it have difficulties getting to judges, above all in the most remote parts of the country where there are no courts, and where, in addition, there are not even the appropriate medical facilities to carry out abortions. So these are problems that need to be addressed. This is a failing on behalf of the government that we have to try to remedy. I don't know if I answered your question fully, but Ms. Pazartzis asked about discriminatory practices. I will not come back to the issue of homosexuality because I just talked about that. You were also referring to albino individuals and hate speech. This can happen. All hate speech is punishable when it's on the grounds of religion or race.
Ultimately, no one has chosen to be born as one is, so that is why these facts can be punished. And we have to do so. I've spoken with people who propose that there be a law to condemn hate speech, in particular public hate speech. Perhaps there are MPs and senators who will bring forward such a bill and ask for it to be voted on. And that will be voted on by the Parliament, of course, and it will be promulgated if it happens. But at the moment, we don't have such a law. I don't have the exact statistics here, but I can tell you that society in our country doesn't condemn albinos. There may be some unique cases of that, as in other states. There may be discrimination that you can find, and that can be the case in European states. But these are isolated cases. But I can really tell you that in the DRC, there is no alarming rate of discrimination against albinos. I have to say, for the LGBT community, it's different because society is not ready to accept that. But against albinos, it's not the case. You also spoke about the administration of justice, and you stressed the independence of the judiciary, the importance of that, and the number of judges and the availability of courts throughout the DRC. I will send you the exact figures in the next 48 hours. But on the independence of the judiciary, we continue to fight to make sure that the judiciary is independent and to make judges aware of the major role they play in society, because they are in charge of regulating almost all problems in Congolese society. And even in those cases where they are not supposed to consult with political authorities, some judges and magistrates may not fully live up to their responsibilities. And that is why we need to organize seminars, training courses, and capacity building for magistrates and judges. You asked if courts are available throughout the country. I'd already answered that question. The answer is no. I answered that question yesterday and gave reasons, so I will skip over that now. You also asked about detainees absconding from prisons and the reasons for that. I've been in the government since the 19th of December 2016 as a human rights minister. I have inspected many prisons in the DRC. And I noted the same thing as some of the NGOs who are represented here in the room. And some, in fact, were invited to accompany me on my visits, as well as the UN Human Rights Bureau. Together, we were able to see that there is this problem of prison overcrowding, as you say. We can't deny that, and it's a problem that needs to be solved. It's true that in prison there are people who have been tried and convicted, but there are many other people as well who have been in prison for several months without knowing why they're there. There hasn't been a trial for some of them. Some have not had the opportunity to speak with a lawyer. Others are not able to visit their relatives. It's not because we ban the family from coming, but perhaps the family doesn't know that their relative is in prison. Or perhaps the family can't go hither and yon every day. I have seen people in prison as a result of witchcraft, but witchcraft isn't in the law. We can't prove that. We can't prove what witchcraft is. It's not something that we can measure. Congolese law doesn't recognize witchcraft. I saw a lady in prison. I think she was over 70. She said she was behind bars because she was a widow. One of her sons wanted to sell the house that the husband left. She opposed that, but given that her son was a drug addict, he was able to use these relations to put his mother in prison. I've even seen some children in prison, aged 15 and 16. One of them said that they were behind bars because they'd stolen 3 kilos of wheat. These are things that we can't accept. I discussed these matters with my colleague, the Minister of Justice. We're currently trying to find solutions to these problems. I was accompanied by the Assistant for Justice, and he understood what I said. We need to deal with these situations because the people I've mentioned, these are innocent people behind bars. I won't go into more details, but we are mindful of the fact that there are people who do not deserve to be behind bars. We need to solve this problem. And those, of course, who deserve to be in prison, well, that needs to be kept up and implemented through a trial and a decision by the judge. And of course, it needs to be a fair trial so that people can defend themselves. And if the judge believes that the person should remain in prison, then that's the decision that needs to be taken. I'm doing my utmost with my colleagues from the Ministry of Justice. But at the same time, I would also say we certainly do need to undertake capacity building. It's not just the police that's involved, because when a police officer arrests an elderly lady because her son asked for her to be arrested because on spurious grounds, well, that's clearly unacceptable. The police need to understand that they can't be carrying out favours. They need to understand, and the judges need to understand their genuine role. Of course, punishments need to be meted out when necessary. When people have abused their position, then they need to be punished. And the Supreme Council needs to carry out more punishments to deal with that problem. So to answer the question, yes, prison overcrowding is an issue, and there isn't enough space. When you have a prison that had previously been built to hold 1,500 people and now that has 7,000 people in the same prison, well, of course, simply not enough space for people to sleep or even go to the toilet. So that's a serious problem. The Ministry of Justice has told me that in a project with the European Union, we will be building new prisons. We're starting in the capital, Kinshasa, and then the project will be spread out to the provinces. But in the meantime, we need to free people from prison who shouldn't be there in the first place, or those who have gone through their sentence, or those who've been granted amnesty. You asked if there were inquiries. The expert from the Ministry of Justice will be able to send us that information, and I will pass on the statistics in the next 48 hours. The protection of children. You spoke about the recruitment of minors. In particular, the sexual exploitation and the economic exploitation of children. Certainly, criminal acts against children need to be criminalized. In fact, in January, in this room, the committee had recommended that corporal punishment also be punished, particularly in schools. Now, this needs to be done, because there are children who've been injured at school. Perhaps the teacher may have beaten them on the head, and the children got a wound from that. So that needs to be criminalized. I've spoken with experts from UNICEF on the economic exploitation of children. There are children working in mines, particularly in Katanga. I discussed this with the Minister of Mines. In fact, when I go back, I will be going round all the different mines in the different provinces, and we will be trying to find solutions to that problem to ensure that children don't end up working in mines. I think one of the solutions would be to make school mandatory, because when school is mandatory and provided free of charge, and when parents who refuse to send their children to school are punished, then children won't end up in the mines. It's not the best solution, but it is one of the solutions that we are exploring. There is legislation which governs labor laws, which prohibit child labor. But is the law enforced? I would tend to say no, because if children do end up working in mines, then you can't say they're invisible. We can see that that is the case. There are judges who can see that, police officers, and provincial authorities who can see that that's happening. So the law needs to be more rigorously enforced. Mr. Koita mentioned freedom. He mentioned inquiries, a transparent inquiry to look into crimes committed in Kasai. Yesterday, I said that inquiries had started. The justice system had started inquiries, in particular the military justice system. Given that there were 2 UN experts who lost their lives in Kasai, and that there were unprecedented atrocities committed, unprecedented in the history of the DRC, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, in the light of those events, asked a team of experts, an international team, to be sent to the DRC so as to help the judges in these inquiries. As I said, the team of experts will be arriving in Kinshasa next week. I believe that they've all got their visas. I met with some of them in September here. We can guarantee that we will be welcoming them. We will be providing them with access to all the relevant areas, and they will be able to have access to witnesses. And once the inquiries are concluded, of course, the results will be submitted to the Human Rights Council and also to the Congolese authorities, so that the alleged perpetrators can be brought to justice. These trials will be made public. We agreed this with the UNHCR, with the OHCHR. We were hesitating whether it should be a public broadcast, because there was a debate about whether the witnesses needed to be protected, and maybe a live broadcast of the trial was problematic or even counterproductive. We're not sure yet. We're looking into that. But one thing is clear. As I said at the beginning, the punishment will be commensurate with the seriousness of the crime, so that this doesn't happen ever again in the DRC. We are working with the UN Office on Human Rights. MONUSCO is present. We have the pictures. Yesterday, I don't remember if it was Mr. Koita who spoke about the discovery of 80 mass graves. I would just state that these are alleged mass graves. We're not able to ascertain that they are mass graves until persons have been exhumed. Now, there must be some mass graves, because as I said yesterday, MONUSCO acknowledges that people did have their throats slit and their blood drunk, and people were beheaded, and of course the bodies must have been buried somewhere, and certainly not in state cemeteries. So it's certain that these mass graves do exist. But only after the inquiries have been carried out will we be able to tell how many there are, maybe 20, 80, but in any case, it is to be condemned, because innocent human beings lost their lives, and the perpetrators of these crimes need to be punished. It's true that there are law enforcement officers who behaved badly, and members of the military behaved badly. It is true. They did use weapons against the people, weapons that they should have used for protection. these officials will be punished. Some already have been convicted, and those who have not yet been convicted, well, the inquiries have been carried out and they will be punished. But we can't tar everyone with the same brush. You can't say that all members of the army are thugs. There are some members of the military who acted alone, who did not obey the order from their higher officials not to harm the local population. And the same goes for the security forces. But there are also civilians. I think 2 deputies, provincial authorities, are also involved, or alleged to have been involved, and the judge may confirm that, involved in the atrocities in Kasai. But rest assured, regardless of the rank of anyone who was involved, these people will be punished, and severely punished at that. Mr. Koita spoke about detention centres. Illegal detention centres. He spoke about the National Intelligence Agency as well, and the Military Intelligence Centre. We are discussing this matter now with the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Defence. We are discussing this matter and how to remedy the situation. And when the National Intelligence Agency deals with the criminals who are searched for example, in the atrocities committed in Kasai, they should be brought before the Attorney General of the Republic. And they have to be informed why they've been arrested. The time for pre-trial detention can be assessed by the prosecutor, but ultimately the perpetrator has to be brought to book, and that is what the law stipulates. Mr. Koita also spoke about potential violations of the rights of detainees. I have said that there are people who were in prison who did not deserve to be there, but there are also people who have been convicted. But of course, even those people also have rights. Convicts have rights to be imprisoned in acceptable, humane conditions. They have a right to a bed. They have a right to adequate sanitation and the right to be fed, the right to have access to medical care and to receive members of their family. It is true that sometimes these rights are not upheld. As I say, there is this problem of overcrowding, so you can imagine that it follows from that not all prisoners have a proper bed to sleep on. And sometimes the health facilities are not acceptable. Sometimes there isn't enough food for all the detainees. Or even if there is, then they maybe aren't eating properly. We are seeking solutions to these problems. We will bear your comments in mind. We will heed your comments and make sure that we apply what you've said. On behalf of the government, I do accept that the committee appoints members who will be looking at the implementation of the recommendations made by the committee, and that will allow us to make headway and to avoid repeating the same thing over and over again without having made progress next year. It would be nice for us to come back next year and say that a lot of things have changed and problems have been solved and things have improved. Mr. Koita also spoke about the professionalization of prison staff. I do acknowledge that this is something that needs to be looked at. Prison shouldn't be a place of terror where the prison wardens and staff violate the laws of the Republic. Mr. Benachot spoke about the root causes of the crisis, in his view, because there have not been elections held, because the mandate of the president has come to an end. I don't think that's entirely true, nor is it entirely false. The crisis in the DRC goes back several years. Now, of course, we can't excuse that. We need to find solutions. But nor can we say that it's just because we haven't had elections. That might be 10% of the causes of the crisis. Importantly, you wanted to know exactly when elections could be held. The National Electoral Commission, which is independent, is concluding voter registration at the moment. The delay in this process is as a result of the fact that we were not able to finalize this process without also including the Kasai province, which, after all, accounts for 10% of the Congolese electorate. The Kasai region is supposed to be one of the areas where the opposition is most popular. So, of course, if we didn't include that region, then it would create an uproar in the DRC, and then we'd talk about human rights violations again, because 10% of the electorate is not to be sniffed at. And this province is already in a crisis, and they'll say, well, we don't acknowledge your president because we didn't get a chance to have a vote. So we thought that we had to finalize this process of voter registration, including in Kasai. We began with the territories which have enjoy comprehensive peace and security, and we will be finalizing this process shortly. I think that in the next 2 months, I don't speak on behalf of the Electoral Commission, but I think in perhaps 2 or 3 months we will have finished this process in Kasai as well. We are also waiting for the election date to be set. It's imminent, though. It may happen today or tomorrow. And then we will have this date set for the election. But the elections will be held. I would just like to correct one thing that Mr. Benachot said. I didn't say that all NGOs were working with the opposition. That's not true. There are some NGOs who do play their true role, a constructive role, making constructive criticism and pointing out what isn't right and helping us to improve. There are many NGOs who play that role. I can see some of them here, with an exchange that sometimes is in contradiction with what the government thinks, but we have a respectful dialogue. But there are just some NGOs that I would criticize because they are biased. NGOs are not supposed to take sides, either for the majority or the opposition. The NGOs are supposed to be in the middle with civil society. I have a great deal of respect for these NGOs who work in particular in the interior of the country, sometimes in very difficult conditions. But they help us to improve the situation. And they provide us with specific information. And I would say to the fellow citizens who are here that we will be having a meeting this afternoon at the permanent mission of the DRC to see what can be done to improve things. So we'll be having this meeting, and we'll also be meeting in Kinshasa. So I don't think you quite understood what I had said.
You talked about the fate of street children. Well, I would say that the streets don't give birth to children. There shouldn't be any children in the streets. Whatever the reasons for this, there shouldn't be these children in the streets. And whatever the issues may be, these children must be accommodated somewhere, either in families or in social structures. It's true that a lot of children end up in the street because people call them witches. Just as you find this hard to understand, we find it hard to understand. No one can tell you what witchcraft is. No law in our country stipulates what witchcraft amounts to. Now, the proliferation of churches on every street corner doesn't make things any easier. These churches, in order to justify their existence, play on the fears of the people. They trump up these small areas of dissent that may occur in each family. Say a child doesn't get on with his brother or sister, or a child is going through a teenage crisis and is fighting with his parents. This happens. Or a boy under the influence of his peers may have his ears pierced, and we go ahead and do it even though his parents don't want him to, and then can end up being called a witch. No, the Minister of Justice has proposed that certain or a lot of churches be closed down. Today we have 12,000 churches. We don't need that many. I'm talking about the churches that we can't even identify as being, say, Catholic or Protestant, well-established or Orthodox or Muslim institutions. These are churches that have no real standing or authority. The only authority they have is self-invested by the minister, who just decides that he's going to be in charge. It's not right. And the Minister of Justice is preparing a decree to close down these churches. These churches, in fact, are a scourge. Not only do they send children into the street, but they are destroying families. Now, family is the very foundation of society. A woman is told that a man she's been living with for 20 years is a witch or a warlock and is not the man for her. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who refuse to go and work because these pastors tell them that God is good and that God will give them money and God will give them free food. And what they aren't being told is that the Bible says that thou shalt have your bread by the sweat of your brow. So the fact is that we're thinking of closing down these churches as part of the solution because we have to work. Congo, the DRC isn't going to get anywhere unless people go and work. The DRC will go nowhere if children don't go to school. The next generation will not be educated otherwise. Congo is not going to develop if we lock ourselves up in these churches, which I would describe as sects, where people are told that anyone who's different is a witch. It is a problem for us. I recognize this fact. And the state must take action and go back to basics and find solutions. Certain street children have been taken up by the Ministry of Gender, Family and Children, and some of them are in agreement to go into social facilities. Certain orphanages are taken in. These children, in fact, are not orphans, but they are housed in orphanages. Sometimes these are run by secular institutions, other ones that are run by Catholic sisters or Catholic priests. But some solution has to be found because in these orphanages, the children are not educated. So it doesn't solve anything. It's good that the children are no longer in the streets, but children have to go to school. And they must be fed properly, and they should have access to health services. This is the state's responsibility, as Mr. Benashur said. We are trying to find solutions. And I hope that we'll be able to stamp out this scourge with the support of the committee, NGOs, but the main role has to be played by the Congolese state. You said that only 25.5% of children were on the civil status registries. This is true because the civil registry offices are not in place throughout the territory of the DRC. At the beginning, these offices only existed in the big cities and in the built-up areas, in the provinces. So only children born in the cities were lucky enough to have their births registered. And what is more, the parents themselves had to take the initiative of having their children registered because, unfortunately, in our society, a parent may say, well, this is my child, and they have a certificate from the maternity hospital or the clinic saying that this is their child, and they feel that no one can take their child from them. They have that piece of paper, and they don't see it as a vital need for the child to have an actual birth certificate. Madam Minister of Gender, the Family, and the Child has started awareness-raising campaigns. Her predecessors had done the same. The government has even asked all of the villages and towns in the DRC to give out birth certificates free of charge so that parents have no excuse for not registering the births of their children. But we still can not say we've reached the requisite rate. I think the rate worldwide is about 80%. Perhaps one of the solutions, I don't say it's the only one, would be to require a birth certificate to be presented when the child is enrolled in school. As any responsible parent wants to have his or her child go to school, if they know that the child has access to the school only with a birth certificate, then perhaps this is one of the solutions. But it's true that this is also a problem we have to solve. 27.5% is a very low rate. Mention was made of domestic violence by Ms. Keres. This also has to be recognized as being an act of torture like any other. This was discussed yesterday. I think that only a law sanctioning domestic violence could deter people. And there would have to be awareness raising anyway of those in charge of enforcing this law. Also, the general public would have to be made aware of the need to denounce acts of domestic violence. It is not right, because one has given birth to a child, that one claims the right to hit that child every day, or because a man has married a woman. I often hear this in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Well, I gave this money, all this money for her dowry. She's my wife. You can't tell me what to do with her afterwards. It's a question of women's rights. It's a question of human rights and on denouncing domestic violence. Also, you mentioned freedom of expression. You mentioned the Higher Audiovisual Commission of the DRC. It's known as the CESAC. It has the same status as the Independent Electoral National Commission. These are totally independent institutions which are aimed at bolstering democracy. It's true that a lot of work has been done by this Audiovisual Commission as a regulatory body. Broadcasts that are considered to be immoral, or programs that are considered to be immoral, have been taken off the air, both from national channels and also certain private ones. But at the same time, programs inciting to hatred and violence, hatred against certain communities, intercommunity violence. And it's true that this commission is often in conflict with the Ministry of Communication. I will consult with the expert from the Ministry on Communication, but I know that there is a law being prepared on ways of delimiting powers so as to clarify matters and to clearly ascribe to the CESAC, that is the Audiovisual Commission, its areas of work, and define clearly the responsibilities of the Ministry of Communication. You also mentioned that certain online media had been blocked by the Telephone and Communication Regulatory Commission. And it's true that for security reasons, at a certain point in time, the government felt obliged to block certain social networks. You know that at a certain time, when there were the demonstrations of September 16th, 2016, and December 2016, images of violent killings were sent out, and the legend was that this was happening in Kinshasa. These were old images from Côte d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone and Liberia, in fact. And certain activists, I wouldn't say where they were from, but at any rate, they published these photos on the social networks and were trying to put across the idea to people that this was happening in Kinshasa. This meant that they were stirring up terror and fear, but also violence. People hear that this is happening in Kinshasa, and they understand that there is a community that has attacked certain people, and then they think that they can go and take revenge on that community. So the government felt it was advisable to suspend the social networks' activities for reasons of security. You mentioned the prohibition on public demonstrations, and I answered that question yesterday, and I can't really add anything to what I've already said. I've given you the reasons why these demonstrations were banned. It was a temporary measure. You wanted to know? You also talked about the excessive use of force by law enforcement agencies. I've answered this question because Mr. Benachur raised the same issue. I only have 15 minutes left. You spoke about the problems of indigenous peoples. I see a compatriot here in the room who was in my office, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I've received about 12 pygmies, and it's true that what happened in the Katanga province was serious. There are people who lost their lives, and that could have been avoided because of a land dispute between the pygmies and other Bantu communities. Hitherto, there had been no problems with the pygmies and other communities. Moreover, my compatriot here, if he hadn't told us, we wouldn't have known he was a pygmy, since pygmies look like all other Bantus. But the problem arises in villages where certain communities want to steal the land from the pygmies, and it is up to the government to resolve this issue. I know that the Ministry of the Interior went to the Katanga region to try to resolve the problem, but I guarantee that pygmies have the same rights as everyone else. We don't say that the children of pygmies are not allowed to go to school. We don't say that they can't work in public office or that they can have a private sector job. They have the same rights as everyone else. So pygmies living in the cities don't have the same problems, perhaps, as those who are living in villages, where they can be distinguished from everyone else because of their apparel. But in Congolese society, there is no real problem between pygmies and other communities. They themselves told me that they would like me to support the law, which was submitted to the National Assembly to allow them to live in peace in their social setting, to preserve their cultural heritage. And this law is currently before the National Assembly, but as far as I know, the National Assembly has already published the laws that will be discussed during this session, and that law isn't on the schedule. I could give you the reply in 48 hours, and I will ask when this law is scheduled for submission to the National Assembly. Mr. Santos Pais talked about the protection of journalists, human rights defenders, and opponents, the opposition. It's true that journalists need protection, as human rights defenders and members of the opposition do. It's true that journalists have been assaulted. They've had their equipment seized while they were on the job. Certain police officers, to be frank, act alone. They are not ordered to do this. Of course, this doesn't absolve the government of responsibility. Of course, it's up to the government to enforce the law. But at the same time, there really needs to be training of police officers. I spent 18 years working as a journalist for television. I know what journalists go through. And these police officers act alone. I once asked a policeman why he took the TV camera off the TV5 journalist. I asked why he was so aggressive. He was doing a film of the demonstration to say bad things about the country. And I responded, well, the journalist is there to draw the attention of the government to things that are not working, because nothing's ever perfect. The policemen just don't understand, and I tried to explain to this particular individual that he shouldn't act like that he should give the equipment back. At the same time, I contact his superiors, his bosses, to ask for him to be reprimanded, because it is not right for him to get off scot-free if he's attacking someone who's just doing their job. But again, these are isolated cases. There have been journalists who have incited to hatred and who say that because this lady comes from this or that tribe, I'm from a different tribe, we don't agree on certain facts. And on certain political issues, it becomes a conflict between communities, even though we don't always represent our communities. People oversimplify things and incite to hatred, and those journalists should be sanctioned. But those are isolated cases, and the journalists and human rights defenders absolutely need our protection. Well, La Lucha, certain demonstrations, well, La Lucha doesn't speak, but people write, say, elections 2016, and they don't move, they just stay where they are, and they have their demands on a piece of paper. An over-enthusiastic policeman arrives, he brings 15 people with him, and he takes them to some unknown location. That policeman in such a case is acting alone. He didn't receive any order to do that. I am telling you what I've seen from myself and what I've checked out. I contacted La Lucha, and then they say, well, 15 people came in. Why was that done? Because they were disrupting law and order. What did they do? Did they throw rocks? Did they insult people? And they answered no. And they come back and say, well, who gave you the order? No one. So the problem is strengthening capacity. And in public opinion, you sometimes hear that people somehow think that the government ordered this or that. They're often over-anxious policemen who go out on their own and do this. I think we need to know how many policemen have been prosecuted and convicted for this type of action, because nonetheless, cases have been brought by the Ministry of Human Rights and by NGOs, and also by individuals in an individual capacity who were assaulted. You talked about the political prisoners. Well, I call those people members of the opposition in prison. There are members of the opposition who are in prison, but who have been convicted for common law offenses. It was again Mr. Santos Pais who talked about the case of Mr. Jumi, for example. Mr. Jumi was convicted of rape. During the trial, he himself recognized when the young girl was brought before him, with whom he had sex at the time, who was 16 years old and another 17, in front of his wife in a public trial, he says, yes, I recognize that I had sexual relations with this girl, but only once. As if rape, if it's only done once, is not a punishable offense. He was convicted for common law offenses. He is a member of the opposition, but he isn't, because of that fact, to escape justice. If he commits a crime, he has to be held liable for his actions.